Okay. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. As folks are trickling in, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself in the chat and telling us where you're calling in from, if you're comfortable with that, just to kind of get the conversation going. We're going to try our best to make this interactive with a couple pauses for questions that I'll read to Gary throughout, but just want to get the conversation going in the chat as well. I'll start that out.
Yeah. Also, let us know like what where you're from, but also like maybe something about what you want to get out of the webinar. Hi,
Absolutely.
Cindy.
Thanks for joining us, Cindy.
Yeah, Brittany, North Carolina League of Municipalities. Welcome, Brittany. Okay, Paul Crosby, Reach Success, calling from Cleveland. Hey, Paul. Hi, all. This is Nick from Cleveland, Ohio. Hi, Nick. Oh, that Nick.
Yes.
Good.
Great. Okay, we've got, safe to say, a quorum going so far. That's good.
Yep. And again, for those who are just chiming in, if you could go into the chat function, just say hello, let us know where you're from, and maybe a little bit about what you hope to get out of this webinar. Luckman from Nigeria, welcome. Hey, great to have some folks from Africa here.
Absolutely.
Hi, all. Julius from Nairobi, from Kenya. Fabulous. Great to see
Awesome.
the African representation here. I'm very happy about that. Wow, now you guys are piling on. Slow down here. Latoya from Racine College. Welcome, Latoya. Beth Hess, Fayetteville Technical Community College. Awesome. Andy Jones from Durham. Welcome, Andy. Padmas Udha from
Sudha.
India. Wow.
Yeah.
Padmas Huda. I'm sorry if I butchered your name. Padmas Huda. Thank you, Nick. Cheryl Mitchell from SBDC in Wisconsin just read Who Owns the Ice House. Awesome, Cheryl. Hope you enjoyed it. And then we've got Ray from WorkSource in Spokane. So we got some workforce folks here too. This is fabulous.
Yes, awesome.
Okay, great.
Okay, well, I'll keep monitoring the chat as things get started, but looking at time and knowing we have a lot to talk about today, and I'm sure we're going to have some really great questions from such a diverse group. Let's get things rolling.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. And welcome, Zeb from Vermont. Glad to have some Northeast representation here as well.
Absolutely.
So, all right, I'm going to jump in and get started here. I'll switch to some slides in a minute. And thank you, Nick, for setting all of this up. I want to take you all a little bit on a journey today, tell you a little bit about what I've learned over the last couple of decades. What I've been trying to figure out essentially is how underdogs win. I mean, that's really the essence of what this is all about for me. And this is a question that I asked myself in January of 1991. How do underdogs win? How do people who have no particular advantage in life manage to rise above their circumstances and create some sort of meaning and prosperity in their own lives? How do they do it? And we quickly realize that they're innovative and entrepreneurial in some way, right? And so I spent the last maybe 12 years or so traveling around the world, interviewing hundreds and hundreds of what I would call unlikely entrepreneurs, the underdogs and the misfits, people who have been locked out, left behind, people who have no particular advantage in life other than the way they think. And what we did is we distilled what I was looking for in these interviews was sort of what's the underlying logic that's driving their behavior, right? There's more to being entrepreneurial than writing a business plan or operating a business. I wanted to understand, how do they recognize opportunities that the rest of us overlook? And what do they do when they see an opportunity, but they don't have resources, they don't have access to powerful people or Ivy League diplomas or a powerful network of people? How do they do that? So That's really the question I've been asking for several decades now. And as I began to interview all these entrepreneurs, I then began to turn to the literature and the behavioral sciences, psychology, cognitive psychology, behavioral psychology, social psychology, and so forth, to explain what we're seeing here. And so that's what I'm really eager to share with you, because I feel as though I've stumbled into something that's much, much more profound than what I originally was seeking. So I want to take you on that journey with me today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here quickly. And let's jump right in. Nick, we okay? You can see my screen here?
Yep, all
rolling?
good to go.
Okay.
Everything's looking clear.
Thank you, Nick. Okay, so this is really the first of two-part webinar. And I apologize, I'm Gary. I'm the founder and CEO of the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. If you want to follow us on social media, I'm at G. Schoniger, or you can follow us at Eli Mindset. This is the first webinar. It's really about the underpinnings of our philosophy, the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program. Tomorrow was part 2. We'll talk about how to use what we learned today to create entrepreneurial learning environments, whether it's in your household, whether it's in your classroom, whether it's in your organization or your community. What to do, how to actually create the environment is what we'll talk about tomorrow. So before we get rolling here, just a brief commercial. We are the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. We are focused on entrepreneurial mindset education, professional development, training, workshops, and courseware. We serve individuals, organizations, academic institutions around the world. That's what we do. Our focus is solely on the entrepreneurial mindset. So let me begin with this, obvious statement, right? The world has changed in ways that now require everyone to think like an entrepreneur. And I draw your attention to the words think, because I do not mean to say that everyone should be an entrepreneur in a traditional sense. I don't mean to say that everyone should, drop what they're doing and start a business. I'm saying we all need to be more innovative and entrepreneurial. So the questions I'm really asking here are, how can we, in whatever role, in whatever position we happen to find ourselves, how can we be more innovative and entrepreneurial? Is the first question. And the second question is, how can we encourage others to do the same? How can we encourage our children, our students, our workforce, and our citizens to be more innovative and entrepreneurial, to better equip them with the skills required to adapt and thrive? So the world is changing. What does that look like? Here's a brief sketch that I borrowed from Thomas Friedman's book called Thank You for Being Late, in a conversation he had with a guy named Eric Astro Teller. He's the head of Google X Research. And Teller laid this out on a napkin, and I'll abbreviate it here. What he's saying is that the rate of technological advancement over time accelerates. Technological advancements tend to build on each other. We have Moore's law, where computing power is doubling every 2 years. It's accelerating. It's going faster and faster and faster over time. So let's say here we are, right? The rate of change is almost perpendicular. It's just happening so quickly. But what Teller points out is that the human ability to adapt is not a hockey stick. It's more of a gradual uphill slope. And, I think this is what Alvin Toffler wrote about in Future Shock, that at some point we're going to get to the place where technological advancement outstrips our ability to adapt. And I'm not saying we're there yet. I think if we're not there, we're very close to being there. But what I'm saying is, the real point that I want to make is that the mindset that once enabled us to succeed and thrive is rapidly becoming obsolete. And that's really the point. And so the point I'm trying to make here also is that the entrepreneurial minded is perhaps best equipped with the attitudes and skills required to adapt and thrive in a rapidly changing world, right? When we look at what entrepreneurs do, these are people who are highly resilient and resourceful. They're creative and critical thinkers who can identify and solve problems in highly ambiguous circumstances when the path is not clear and the rules are not well defined. They not only invent new products and services that create jobs that revitalize our communities, but they improve existing products and services within existing organizations. They solve problems from the most mundane to some of the most challenging problems of our time. They're essentially problem solvers. They're problem finders, they're problem solvers. And my point here is that there is unlimited global demand for those who can think like an entrepreneur. Like, these are the attitudes and skills that the world now demands. So we understand the value of entrepreneurial activity from an economic perspective, that it's essential for creating vibrant, equitable, and sustainable communities. But we also have to recognize that entrepreneurial thinking is essential for organizations to adapt and thrive in today's rapidly changing world. We need intrapreneurial thinkers. And this is what I mean when I say that the mindset that once enabled us to thrive is rapidly becoming obsolete. In fact, the case I'm going to make today is that the mindset that once enabled us to succeed is now becoming maladaptive in a rapidly changing world. And I'll make that case in just a minute. So we're seeing, big thinkers around the world, like the World Economic Forum, saying things like entrepreneurship education is essential for developing the human capital necessary for building the societies of the future. And to me, entrepreneurship education, entrepreneurial mindset education is all about human capital. That's really what this is about. It's about optimizing engagement and unlocking human potential. I found another piece published by the OECD in 2015 called Entrepreneurship in Education. And this was the first paper that I found, other than what we had published, that started to point to the benefits of entrepreneurship education beyond just purely economic drivers. Increased societal resilience, individual growth, increased academic engagement, and improved equality. And that's really in alignment with our view of entrepreneurship education. One particular statement from the World Economic Forum grabbed my attention, in which they said it's not enough to add entrepreneurship on the perimeter, that it needs to be at the core of the way education operates. So it's, it's great that you have an incubator, a makerspace, an accelerator program, a small business program, entrepreneurship program, whatever, in your institution. We need to bring it to the core of the way education operates. It needs to be interdisciplinary. It needs to be encouraged from, grade 1 all the way through K-12 into higher education. As Jaime Casap, the former head of Google Education, is famous for saying, we need to stop asking students what they want to be when they grow up, and we need to start asking them what do they need to learn in order to solve those problems. I think that's really the mindset shift that needs to occur. So how do we do that? How do we shift entrepreneurship from the perimeter to the core of the way education operates? So in this webinar, I want to hit 4 key points. I want to redefine entrepreneurship. I want to talk about what a mindset is. I want to identify some of the underlying beliefs that drive entrepreneurial behavior. And I want to talk a little bit about what motivates entrepreneurs. And I'll pause between each of these 4 concepts for questions. You can formulate your questions in the chat function, and we'll address them at the pause. So as I'm going through this, please write whatever questions you have in the chat, and we'll stop and get to them. So let me start by redefining entrepreneurship, right? the reason we're stuck on the perimeter is that is in the way that it lies in the way in which we define entrepreneurship, right? Our ability to embrace an entrepreneurial mindset is limited by the ways in which we define it. And for so many of us, we hear the word entrepreneur and it conjures the image of the Silicon Valley whiz kids, the high-tech venture-backed entrepreneur. And that's great. These are really fantastic stories, but they don't represent the day-to-day reality of how the typical entrepreneur thinks or behaves, or it doesn't really represent the mindset, the motivation, or the methods of a typical entrepreneur. And it's a little bit challenging to me because it skews our thinking about not only who can be an entrepreneur, but how to be an entrepreneur, right? And I guess part of my point here is that we need to stop thinking of entrepreneurship in this binary way. You either are or you're not. You're either going to be somebody who starts a company or you're going to be somebody who works in the company. And I think it's that binary thinking that keeps us stuck on the perimeter. And again, not everyone wants to start a business, but we're all inherently driven to be innovative and entrepreneurial given the chance. So in 2008, I was hired by the Cisco Entrepreneur Institute to do a gap analysis on the entrepreneurship education ecosystem in the United States. And that's where I began interviewing hundreds of entrepreneurs around the US and looking at entrepreneurship programs everywhere. And that's really where we saw the gap, that the way entrepreneurship was being characterized in the classroom was largely divorced from the day-to-day reality of what the typical entrepreneur was actually doing. So Cisco gave me the platform to go around the country and interview all these entrepreneurs. At the same time, I was doing some research. I came across a study done by a guy named Amir Bideh. He was on leave from Harvard when he did this, published this study. I was trying to understand the everyday unlikely entrepreneur. Bideh was looking at large established companies like Walmart, Microsoft, Hewlett-Packard, Waste Management. So I went out and interviewed about 200 everyday underdog entrepreneurs. Bideh went out and looked at about 200 case studies of these high growth companies, right? And I put these 4 logos up here. Those are 4 of the companies that were in his survey. What Bideh said in this book was that even these large established companies have what he called humble improvised origins, right? And that term connected with me because what Bideh found very closely matched what we were finding in our interviews of the underdog entrepreneurs. Very, very close alignment here. So here's what Bideh noted in his interview of about 200 large established companies. He said that they seem to have humble improvised origins. And what he meant by that was there's no big idea. The idea is not a patentable thing that changes everything and takes them, to this meteoric rise. The founders of these companies, of these large established companies, they're not spending much time writing formal business plans, right? And this is where the business school guys, kind of put up the defensive. And it's like, this isn't my opinion. This is what the data show. This is what we've also found in our analysis. I've now interviewed about 500 entrepreneurs around the world. They often laugh in my face when I ask, did you write a business plan? Nor are they doing, formal market research. Bideh described it as ad hoc, face-to-face interaction and gut instinct. What's very astonishing is that what Bideh found in his sample is that these companies were created with, on average, about $10,000. That was just cobbled together through credit cards and second mortgages and what we affectionately refer to as the 3 F's, which is friends, fools, and family. So they don't have a lot of money. And lastly, they have little or no experience in their chosen field, right? And this was very closely matched what we found. I wasn't clever enough to ask this, but Bidet said that in his survey, 40% of these founders had no experience whatsoever, right? So when you look at this data, how does an inexperienced, unfunded entrepreneur manage to recognize and actualize an opportunity? How do they do it? And when we look at this data, we tend to fall back to a default assumption that entrepreneurs possess some sort of dispositional traits that enable them to do this. And, Schumpeter referred to the entrepreneur as a wild spirit. There was another economist in the 1930s, Frank Knight, who wrote that the entrepreneur's decision-making process was a scientifically unfathomable mystery. So I'm going to try to unravel that here in a minute. Using this concept called transformation theory, it was developed by a guy named George Land, who was a systems scientist. And he developed transformation theory as a framework for understanding the nature of change within any system. So I'm going to use Land's theory here not only as a framework for understanding change, but as a framework for, what would I say, for disentangling entrepreneurial activity from managerial activity. So here's how it works. What Land is saying is there are 3 phases of change within any living system: an organism, an animal, a human, a company, a culture, whatever. And it starts with a discovery phase. The organism is searching for a connection with its environment. Once the connection is found, then the organism stops searching and starts to replicate what it found in the discovery phase in order for it to grow. And then at some point, the growth starts to slow as the organism is now fading into obsolescence. Or in some cases, it's going to reinvent itself, which is the beginning of a new S-curve. So these are breakpoints. These orange dots represent breakpoints. So what Land is saying here is that each of these phases requires distinct rules for survival. And that each phase, that the rules for survival in the first phase are maladaptive in the second phase. And the rules for survival in the second phase are maladaptive to the third phase. So the trick, according to Land, is to understand which phase you are in so that you know which rules to apply. That's really the basics for transformation theory. So what does that look like for us humans, right? Well, how do we connect with our environment, right? As humans living in a modern society, we connect with our environment by exchanging. And I borrowed this quote from Adam Smith, where he said, "Every man lives by exchanging." He wrote that in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations, right? So the question I want to ask all of you rhetorically is, what is it that we exchange? And with whom do we exchange it? And what is the mechanism by which we learn how to become useful, right? So we connect with our environment by making ourselves useful to other humans. That's the basic premise. The question is, what is it that we exchange that's useful? How do we learn how to become useful, right? So most of us go through school, we learn how to become useful, right? That's sort of the discovery phase. Childhood, formalized education. How do we know we hit the first break point? Well, let's just say the first break point comes when we get our first real job out of school. We can now support ourselves, right? So now now we're in the second phase. Now we're not in the discovery phase anymore. Now we're out in the real world practicing our craft. We're getting better and better at it. We're learning, we're incrementally improving. We're focused on efficiency so that we can grow, right? And again, that's Land's theory. The organism, once it finds a connection, it goes into the second phase and starts to replicate the connection it found so that it can grow. Well, then at some point, the growth starts to slow. And now here we are moving into either obsolescence, AKA retirement, or shift happens and we've got to reinvent ourselves, right? That's what it looks like from a human perspective. But digging in a little bit deeper, the mindset, the rules for survival in each phase are dictated by situational factors that are not always obvious. And so most of us have learned how to become useful within highly stable, routinized, other-directed, rule-bound learning environments, right? We follow career paths that have very clear paths. You got to take these courses, you got to pass these courses in order to get the degree that says you're an engineer or a lawyer or whatever it is, right? And those systems, those learning systems, prepare us to work within very similar work environments, within highly stable, routinized, other-directed, rule-bound working environments, right? And that's sort of, that's really the represents sort of the peak of the Industrial Revolution in the West. What Land is saying here, though, and this is the trick, is we get stuck at the second break point. We tend to get stuck when the growth starts to slow. We respond inappropriately to that signal very often. We tend to double down and continue to try to do what we were doing in the second column, faster, better, cheaper, rather than recognizing there's a new way is required, right? So that's really the big, the paradox of transformation theory, that we get stuck in this second break point because of the skills and the attitudes that were absolutely essential for our success in column 2 are now the attitudes, behaviors, and skills that are going to prevent us from adapting to the new reality. Land put it quite simply: nothing fails like success. The longer you have been in column 2, the more successful you have been in column 2, the more immersed you are in column 2 culture, the more likely you are to struggle when it comes time to adapt. Jared Diamond said it a little bit differently in his book, Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed, in which he wrote, the values to which people cling most stubbornly under inappropriate conditions are those values that were previously the source of their greatest triumphs, right? That's pretty straightforward. Now, so let's ask ourselves, let's go back and look at this, the transformation theory from this perspective. So how do we learn how to become useful in uncertain, ambiguous circumstances, right? How do we do that in the new world of work? So let's expand this discovery column. This is, again, the discovery phase. I've just called it entrepreneurial discovery. The question I'm asking is, how do we figure out how to make ourselves useful to other humans when there's no clear path and there's no preordained set of rules, right? How do we go off in the wilderness? As the Olin College president, I've forgotten his name, said, how do we create our own knowledge and invent our own career, right? It's like off trail, as expeditionary learning is what he described it as. So again, the discovery begins, but let's talk about the circumstantial factors that are easy to ignore, but they're very important factors. In the entrepreneurial discovery phase, we're operating within a very, very high degree of ambiguity. Where most of us went to school and learned how to become useful in pretty unambiguous circumstances. The paths are clear, the rules are well defined, right? There's not a lot of ambiguity. We're also stepping out into a resource-constrained circumstance. So those two factors, and again, you know, for most of us while we're in school, our parents are providing for us. We may not have access to a lot of resources, but at least our basic needs are provided for us by our parents, right? Or some other adult. The point here is very simple, but very important. This highly ambiguous resource-constrained environment are the situational factors that determine the attitudes, behaviors, and skills required to succeed in that environment. So what does that look like, right? What are the rules for survival in this highly ambiguous resource-constrained environment? Well, we're trying to figure out how to make ourselves useful to other humans. So now this begins with problem-finding skills. This requires empathy, curiosity, observation, and inquiry, right? In most of us, when we're in column 1 or column 2, we're taught to focus narrowly. We're taught to compete with others, right? The entrepreneurial perspective is we've got to look up and look at the bigger picture. What's missing? What's not working? What's frustrating? What could be improved, right? We're looking at the broader picture rather than just our own narrow understanding. It also requires problem-finding skills, right? This is about creativity, innovation, critical thinking, experimentation and adaptation, what I would call micro-experimentation, collaboration and teamwork, networking, effective communication, and resourcefulness. It also requires self-direction and self-regulation, an internal locus of control, the ability to tolerate ambiguity, to become a self-directed learner, to become self-aware, and to develop resilience, right? The point is that entrepreneurial skills are 21st century skills. You know, these are the skills employers demand. These are skills the world now demands. They don't always call them entrepreneurial skills. Sometimes they call them soft skills, which drives me a little nuts. But the point is, these are the skills. You'll recognize these are the skills every student and every worker will need to adapt and thrive in a new world of work. So I'm going to pause now and end on this note that a simple way to define entrepreneurship is as the self-directed pursuit of opportunities to create value for others. And this simple definition allows us to embrace it regardless of the circumstances. This, regardless of the resources we have, regardless of the circumstances we find ourselves in, anyone can embrace this definition. The more useful we become, the better off we're likely to be. I mean, that's really the essence of entrepreneurship. And you know, it's a little bit different because most of us have been taught that someone else is going to tell us how to become useful. And we're going to go out in the world and do that useful thing that someone else told us how to do. So there's a subtle shift in the underlying assumptions that over time makes an enormous behavior. When we understand entrepreneurship as this definition, we come back to this great mystery, right? And what we realize is that there's no breakthrough to idea because in the beginning, the idea is not obvious. It takes years, sometimes decades, for the opportunity to reveal itself. Sam Walton opened a discount variety store in the middle of a cow pasture in Arkansas in 1946. It was 1969 before he opened his, it was 23 years before he opened his a distribution center. Maybe I got the math wrong there, but it's a long time from the time he started till he was large enough to have a distribution center. The planning is not relevant to opportunity discovery because the data don't exist. The entrepreneur is not planning because they're searching through micro experimentation. And the opportunity they initially pursue is rarely the opportunity they ultimately pursue. And the same is true for the research. The data isn't visible. They learn by doing. They're learning through micro experimentation. They're behaving like detectives trying to solve a mystery rather than gamblers or fortune tellers trying to predict the future. It's the lack of money and the lack of resources, it's the lack of resources and the lack of experience actually work to their advantage. The adversity becomes the advantage. The lack of money combined with the lack of experience forces the nascent entrepreneur to try things that experts or people with access to resources may not be willing to try. So what we have here is a classic David and Goliath situation. They have humble improvised origins, and they turn what to most would look at to it as an adversity, they turn it into an advantage. So I'm going to just stop here and pause for a minute and see if we have any questions, Nick, and then we'll move on to the next segment.
Sure. Great so far. A couple comments right off the bat as we wait for other folks to put in their questions. The first is just a request from Molly, who recently got trained in our Ice House Entrepreneurship program, but has since changed roles at her organization in North Carolina, and just wanted to talk a little bit more about that intrapreneur mindset. So if you wouldn't mind just spending a minute or two just expanding on everything that you've just been saying within an existing organization.
Yeah. Happy to talk about that. That's, again, like, the word entrepreneur arose, I think it showed up in a dictionary in 1763, and it comes from this Latin meaning to swim out and to grasp. But it arose at a time when, for the first time in human history, we needed a word that would distinguish between the person that organized and operated the business and someone who worked in the business. The word employee actually emerged about 100 years later. But so we most of us hear the word entrepreneur and we think that it's someone who organizes and manages a business. But what I'm doing here is looking at this from a behavioral perspective. I'm looking at the entrepreneur, I'm looking at entrepreneurship as a behavioral phenomenon. Why are some people behaving this way? What can we learn about them so we can replicate those conditions in our classrooms, in our organizations, in our communities? Because we need this kind of thinking, right? And if we're making this fundamental attribution error, if we think that entrepreneurs are just somehow born with these traits, we're overlooking all the things that we're doing in our parenting, in our systems of education, in our organizational structures that are systematically inhibiting the development of entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills. So I very much appreciate the question that what you'll see is that entrepreneurs are intrinsically motivated to behave this way. And so it's not very difficult to teach people how to think and act like an entrepreneur, but if the organization itself doesn't encourage and support the behavior, if people feel threatened, they're going to lose their job, if they take any kind of risks, if they're told to just follow the rules, well, then you're not going to cultivate entrepreneurial behavior in your organization. So thank you. And so Javier is saying soft skills, no such thing. These traits are actually the real hard skills. You know, Javier, I'll give you the $20 later for saying that. These are the hardest skills to develop. They're probably also the most important, which is why I bristle when people refer to these as soft skills. So thank you for that comment. Any other questions or comments about how this might have shifted your perspective at what it means to be an entrepreneur or entrepreneurial?
Omar is saying, are there any studies of the mindset of African Americans pre, during, and post-slavery? That's a great question, Omar. I'm not aware of any in particular within the scope that we're talking about, but that's a really interesting niche opportunity for some research. Absolutely.
Absolutely, right? Great question, Omar. Thank you. Any other questions thus far?
Yeah, let's keep going. If you do want to ask a question about the first section, I'll bring it up first thing at the next break.
Okay, that sounds good. Let's keep rolling.
Yep.
Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit, in a little bit more briefly, about what a mindset is. And I'm just going to back up for a second. So we're defining entrepreneurship as the self-directed pursuit of opportunities to create value for others. It's really important that you get that. That definition allows us to apply it in any situation. The more useful you become, the better off you're going to be. And, you know, ask yourself, what is preventing you from becoming more useful to more people? It's a rhetorical question, but it's just a question, you know, it sort of brings out, it's a question that I've constructed to sort of flesh out non-entrepreneurial thinking, right? We come to believe that we can't get any further in life because we need a degree or whatever, and that's just becoming less and less and less true in the world. Okay, so I don't want to go too far back. Now I want to talk about what is a mindset. We all use that word, not always a lot of understanding around what that means. And so I'm going to open with this, my favorite quote of all time from Carl Jung, in which he said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And, you know, hence that impish look on his face, right? This should keep you all up at night. So let's begin with this basic supposition that we all have a mindset, yet few of us are aware of it, much less the ways in which it influences our behavior without our awareness, right? That's the key here. So, you know, I've struggled, I've scoured the literature to find some clinical definition of mindset, and I really haven't found anything. So I sort of reverse engineered it. And I found this definition of culture from Edgar Schein's work at MIT. And why am I talking about culture? Because culture is our collective mindset. So bear with me for a minute. It's a little bit clunky, but I think it's very precise. So Schein just defines culture as a pattern of shared basic assumptions learned by a group as it solved its problems of external adaptation and internal integration that has worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore be taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to those problems. Again, it's a little clunky, very, very precise. So if you reverse engineer it, a mindset is a pattern of basic assumptions learned by an individual as he or she solve problems of external adaptation and internal integration that worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore assumed to be the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to those problems, right? The mindset is an unconscious adaptive mechanism that evolved millions of years before we even had conscious thought. And it allows an organism to adapt to the environment, right? We take on these beliefs and assumptions that we acquire without realizing it, And then they become so deeply held that we don't even know they're there. So a simple definition of mindset might be the underlying beliefs and tacit assumptions that influence our behavior. It's a simple way to say it. Underlying is the key factor here. So our mindset is formed within the context of culture. So the culture shapes our mindset, but our mindset can also shape the culture. There's a bidirectional relationship here where you cannot point to one or the other as the cause or the effect. Here's how it works, right? Let's use the tried and true iceberg analogy. On the surface are the visible artifacts and the observable behavior. Beneath the surface is our explicit knowledge and our espoused values. Yet at the base of the iceberg, we find our implicit knowledge, our deeply held values and taken for granted beliefs and tacit assumptions. That's where the mindset lives. Now, the point here is that what shows up on the surface is more likely to be the result of our implicit knowledge and deeply held, taken for granted beliefs and tacit assumptions, right? So another way of saying this is that our behavior betrays our values, right? I don't, you've heard the saying, like, how does that go? What you do speaks so loudly, I can't hear what you say, right? So we all know someone that complains a lot. That's the observable behavior. Complain, 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 right? Well, what do they tell you? What's their explicit knowledge and espoused values? Well, I want to do something interesting, but the world won't let me. My boss is an idiot. My wife is an idiot. My children get in the way, whatever. Like, I want to do these things, but everyone else is getting in my way. That's what they tell you. But that complaining is more likely to be the result of a deeply held, mostly unconscious sense of powerlessness, of helplessness, of learned how or default helplessness, right? But we're not aware of that. We don't realize that we really feel powerless. It manifests itself in a different way. So all this is to say that the mindset that once enabled to succeed within highly stable, routinized, other-directed, rule-bound systems is distinct from the mindset that will enable us to adapt and thrive in today's rapidly changing world. So what I want to talk about here very briefly are 5 critical dimensions of a mindset that we're interested in. First is our self-efficacy beliefs. Again, these are deeply held beliefs about what we are capable of. It's basically our beliefs about our ability to set and achieve the goals that we desire for ourselves. So you have a high degree of self-efficacy on one end of a spectrum. On the lower end of the spectrum, you might have like a helpless orientation. The second dimension we look at is perceived locus of control, which is a deeply held belief that, so someone with an external locus of control has a deeply held belief that fate, luck, circumstances, or powerful others somehow control my destiny. And this is in contrast to someone who has an internal locus of control that has a deeply held, mostly unconscious assumption that I'm in control of my thoughts and deeds and my own outcomes. We looked at the fixed versus growth mindset. Do I believe that my intelligence and my abilities are finite? They're just in my DNA and there's nothing I can do about it? Or do I believe that I can grow my intelligence, I can expand my intelligence and grow my abilities through practice? This belief, which is we're mostly not aware of, has an enormous impact on the goals we set for ourselves. The fourth dimension we look at is motivation. Are you intrinsically motivated or extrinsically motivated? Is the task itself the reward, or are you doing something for some separable reward? Right? That's a very important factor. People who are intrinsically motivated by the task itself outperform people who are motivated by letter grades and carrots and sticks and dollars and whatever rewards. And lastly, we look at resilience, which stems from what psychologists call an optimistic or pessimistic explanatory style. It's basically, what's the story you tell yourself, specifically when you get into a jackpot, right? Or into a, I should stop using that word because a lot of people don't know it as a negative term. But anyway, what's the story you tell yourself when you find yourself in difficult circumstances? Is it a pessimistic message, this always happens to me, or is it an optimistic message, like I got to find a way out of this? That has an enormous impact on our sense of resilience. So those are some quick dimensions of a mindset. Again, Nick, I'll take a pause here and see if we have any additional questions or comments.
Sure thing. No new questions or comments yet, but let's just give folks a few seconds to chime in. Like I said earlier, if you have any questions that are revolving around the first section, feel free to toss those in the chat as well. No worries there. All right, Andy says, thinking on the iceberg analogy, how difficult is it to reshape a culture or a mindset? Oh, that's a good one, Andy, but it's a big one.
It's a good one, but it's a big one. I would say you got to start with a mindset, right? And in an organization, it needs to be top down and bottom up. In a perfect world, that's what it takes. Highly recommend reading Edgar Schein's work. I mean, he's the guy that really is. He's sort of the thought leader. At least he was the thought leader in organizational culture for the last 2 or 3 decades.
Absolutely.
Can you change the mindset and change purpose? Like, okay, that Padmashuddha, that's
Gary, just real quick, I'm going to read that out loud because it was sent to just us. Can you change the mindset at any stage in a person's life?
Yes. So obviously it gets harder the older we get, but there are plenty of examples of people who are able to change their mindset. I think the key here to understanding how to change a mindset is that we have to become aware that we have a mindset, and we have to learn how to learn and how to unlearn. It's not just about adding to the knowledge we already have. It's about teasing out the beliefs that are no longer relevant or the beliefs that may be holding us back. I think that's really the key. I mean, there's many examples of people that learned, well into their late stages of life. They maintained that sense of curiosity. It's definitely possible. I don't believe that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I started Eli when I was 47 years old. I mean, I've gotten the equivalent of 2 or 3 PhDs in the process, but it's a really important question. Also want to ask that question about, what's the motivation to change, right? We like to resist change. I think that's a default mechanism of survival, is we tend to respond inappropriately to change. We blame others, we dig in, we double down, right? And that's part of the transformation theory message.
Absolutely. Good question from Stacy here. Really appreciate the definition of resilience. How does one learn to be more optimistic in order to be more resilient?
Oh boy, Stacy, that's a beautiful question. I'm going to tell you, don't walk to Amazon and buy Martin Seligman's book called Learned Optimism. It changed my life. It's the best $7 you will ever spend. It's a deep dive into the benefits, not only how you will benefit throughout your life in terms of longer, like healthier, happier, stronger, lower all-cause mortality, lower cancer, lower cardiovascular, higher life satisfaction, higher psychological well-being. That's the book. And I think Nick will probably put that in the notes here at some point,
Just
put a
did,
link
yep.
to it. It's called Learned Optimism. And Belinda, I want to come back to your comment of powerful about blaming others. So there's a cognitive bias called the self-serving bias, right? And a self-serving bias works as this mechanism within our mindset, and it works without our awareness. It works like this. When things go right, we take credit for it. And when things go wrong, we tend to blame outside of ourselves for things going wrong. It's a natural tendency. We all do it. We have to become aware of it so we can actually look within. The point I want to make from your question, Belinda, is that a mindset is a belief system. It's a belief system that is perfectly designed to create the outcomes that it's creating. So the point is, that's what we use Ice House for, to teach students, if you don't like what's coming out on the top of the iceberg, you look at the base of the iceberg. That, again, to quote Jung, he said, where you least want to look is where you're going to find what you most need to find.
Absolutely. Javier's got a good question. How do ethno-racial and cultural factors affect the collective mindset among different groups?
Let me think about that for a second, Javier. How do ethno-racial culture affect the collective mindset? I don't know specifically, but the mindset is an adaptive mechanism that is shaped by the culture. And so, I don't know how to answer that beyond that, Javier, if you've got.
Just to help with that a little bit, the reflexivity of culture and mindset, the collective mindset is affected by the individual mindsets of those within the collective, right? And that affects the cultures. So the cultures are not static. You do not have a culture that is the exact same as it was 500 years ago. That's going to be changing based on the ebb and flow of the reflexivity between our individual and collective mindsets and how that impacts culture, right? So just to add on to what Gary was just saying.
And the other side of that, Javier, is read Jared Diamond's book, Collapse. Like, it's very often we cling to these cultural values. And those are the values that were once the source of our greatest triumphs, but those are the very values that prevent us from adapting. And so that's really an important question too. And it's the other side of it, right? What are the beliefs that we're clinging to that we don't even know? They're so deeply embedded, we're clinging to them, that they're preventing us from adapting into this new world.
And to that point, that makes it devoid, that divorces it from any one culture. This isn't a comment on just American culture or European culture or South American culture, whatever it may be. This is not unique to any one culture. This is true of all humans as we organize within cultures.
Yeah, and I want to address Omar's question. What is the relationship between mindset and cognitive behavior? That I'm not sure how to answer that one, Omar. I'm not sure there is a difference. I mean, I'm looking at, I'm focused on these 5 dimensions of a mindset that have to do with self-efficacy beliefs, intrinsic, extrinsic motivation, internal locus of control, fixed growth mindset, or resilience. So I'm not quite sure how to answer that. Okay, thank you. Okay, Nick, I think we're okay. We're going to move on.
Good to move on. Yep.
Okay, I don't want to keep everyone too long here. So let's look quickly at the underlying beliefs that drive entrepreneurial behavior. So I've been, interviewing, observing, and analyzing entrepreneurial behavior for almost 20 years. And I find that there's this sort of common, mostly unconscious assumption that is something like this. It's up to me to figure out how to make myself useful to other humans. And that by doing so, I can empower myself. That's sort of the base assumption. It's sort of the genesis from which all other entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills emerge, right? Now, the entrepreneurs rarely state this because they're not entirely aware of it. Circumstances have forced them out into this unknown. They're trying to, they've rejected the status quo. Maybe the status quo has rejected them, but they're out in the wilderness with a sharp stick. It's up to me to figure out how to make myself useful to other humans. It's that core assumption that leads to the behavior. So let's talk about optimal engagement here, right? And I'm borrowing this from Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's work in Flow. Like, here's the current reality, and there's the compelling goal. It's in this tension between the current reality and the compelling goal that we become optimally engaged. So what happens when the challenge exceeds the skill? We become very anxious, right? If the challenge exceeds the skill by too much, we'll just shut down. We call that high arousal. We just can't function, right? It's like life or death. You can't function. We freeze. So what happens to the entrepreneurial person in the pursuit of the compelling goal? They're constantly being challenged above their skill level. But because the goal is so compelling, they adapt. They develop new skills. They grow. That's where the growth mindset comes from, right? But what happens to us when our skill level exceeds the challenge? We become alienated and bored and disengaged. And this is, statistically speaking, 87% of workers worldwide fall into that category. 87% of workers, according to Gallup, are not engaged in their work. The vast majority of us are somewhere off in that boredom, disengaged spectrum. So as a result of this pursuit, the current reality to the compelling goal, over time, as we become optimally engaged in the pursuit of our goal, we tend to develop high self-efficacy, an internal locus of control, a growth mindset. We become intrinsically motivated, and we become highly resilient. So these are what I would call the 5 critical dimensions of an entrepreneurial mindset: high self-efficacy, the belief that, a high confidence is really what it is. It's a high sense of confidence, a belief that it's up to me. I'm in control of my life. I can develop the skills necessary to get where I want to go. I'm intrinsically motivated. I'm not just doing this for the money. There's a purpose to what I'm doing. And that's how the purpose is how we tap into this most potent form of human motivation. And over time, because they keep being challenged and they keep overcoming the challenges, they become highly resilient, right? My point here is very simple. An entrepreneurial mindset is an effect rather than the cause of entrepreneurial behavior. And this is where we get this wrong, right? Somebody goes and interviews a successful entrepreneur. They come away, they write a piece about here's the 5 things or the 10 things you need to be in order to be a successful entrepreneur. You need to have, highly confident, you need to be creative, you need to be a critical thinker, and all these things. And what we don't realize is those are effects of the pursuit rather than the cause of the behavior. So I'm going to skip this question. We can glom them together just so we can get to the Q&A at the end, if that's okay, Nick?
That's perfect. Makes sense.
Okay. So I want to get to the last thing, like what motivates the entrepreneur, right? So I talked a little bit about intrinsic motivation as one of the 5 critical dimensions of an entrepreneur. I want to dig in a little deeper here and start with this basic premise that humans are just like any other living thing, that we have this innate drive towards self-actualization. Simply put, we're like acorns with the potential and the drive to become mighty oak trees. That's what Carl Rogers or Kurt Goldstein referred to as the master motivator. Maslow put it differently. He said, human life will never be understood unless its highest aspirations are taken into account. Growth, self-actualization, the striving toward health, the quest for identity and autonomy, the yearning for excellence must now be accepted beyond question as a widespread and perhaps universal human tendency. We are all equipped with the innate desire and the capacity to become all that we can become. Let's just call this the self-actualizing tendency. But what we've learned in the last 30 years or so is that this tendency towards growth requires what the psychologists Deci and Ryan refer to as nutrients, right? Like soil and sunlight and water. We need these psychological nutrients called autonomy, competency, and relatedness. We need to feel as if we're free to make our own choices. We need to feel that we're effective, that we're good at and able to navigate the world. And we need to know that our work matters, that we're making some kind of a contribution to our community. Those are the three nutrients. And what Deci and Ryan teach us is that if those nutrients are attainable, lifelong growth, social integration, and psychological well-being will occur throughout life. We will experience optimal engagement. Here's the trick. If those nutrients are not attainable, we tend to turn to what they call need substitutes. We pursue money, a fancy car. We pursue other things that are replacements for autonomy, competency, and relatedness. And what they demonstrate is that the pursuit of need substitutes actually further undermines our development, our ability to get these basic needs met. So, long story short, what we see in the entrepreneurs, we see an individual pursuing their own interests and their own abilities in ways that benefit other humans. And that's really where this optimal engagement occurs, right? And it goes back to the Jaime Casab question. What problems do you want to solve, and what do you need to learn in order to solve those problems? When we are able to pursue our own interests and develop our own natural abilities in ways that contribute to the greater good, we become optimally engaged. That's well established. Like, that's the trifecta. That is the optimal motivation. The most potent form of motivation lives right there. That's how you explain the behavior of the entrepreneur. So I'm going to end by saying that, entrepreneurship is the self-directed pursuit of opportunities to create value for others. But I'm adding that by creating value for others, we empower ourselves. And I don't just mean we empower ourselves in economic terms, we tap into the most potent form of human motivation by creating value for others. So I'm going to just stop there. We've covered all four of the core topics for today. I want to pause and allow time for additional questions, comments, suggestions.
Great. Again, nothing yet, but we've got plenty of time, so feel free to keep tossing us these really great questions that we fielded so far.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm trying to say here, I'm trying to simplify entrepreneurship, just to break it down into its fundamental building blocks. If you look at the entrepreneur, it's an ordinary person. If you go up to 10,000 feet and look at an entrepreneur, all you're seeing is an ordinary human being trying to self-actualize, right? That's really all it is. If you want to understand entrepreneurial behavior, we need to stop looking at the traits as an explanation and look at the nature of the goal the entrepreneur is pursuing, and look at the relationship she has with that goal, and you'll understand the behavior. That's really what I'm trying, what I took, 65 minutes to say. I just said it in, 65 seconds. So, maybe a rhetorical question for you all is that, do you have a compelling goal, right? Do you have a goal that's gripped you, that you think about, that you can't stop thinking about, that you're pursuing in the margins and the evenings and weekends, something that excites and energizes you? And the question, the second part of the question is, if you don't have a compelling goal, ask yourself, why not? What's standing in the way? And the other question to think about is, what happens to us as humans in the absence of a compelling goal, right? We're easily distracted. We get caught up in all kinds of things, right? It's very, very unlikely that we're going to self-actualize in the absence of a compelling goal. And Maslow said something to the effect that even when our basic needs are met, a discontent will stir within us unless we are doing what we are fitted for doing. And this is where he said, a writer must write, a painter must paint, a man or a woman must be what he or she can be. So, and I hope this provides a basis, because tomorrow now we're going to show you how to put this all into practice, how to use the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program as a tool to encourage this behavior in your children, your students, your organization, or your communities.
Omar, regarding your question about partnership, I'd be happy to discuss that after this call.
Yep.
Ray is asking, how do you equate compelling goal with purpose and passion?
Ray, it's a fantastic question. I would define a compelling goal as, let me see if I can go backward here in the slides. Oh, there it is. So if you can still see the slides, Ray, I would say that is, those are the ingredients that make a goal compelling. So first of all, you've got to be interested in it, because if you're not interested in it, you're not going to stick with it, right? Someone who is interested is going to be able to outdo you, right? And it's got to be in your wheelhouse of your signature strength or your capabilities. So you got to be capable of being good at it. So if I'm interested in sumo wrestling, that's great, because I'm never going to be a sumo wrestler. I'm not good at it. I don't, that's not it. And then it's got to benefit, in order to be compelling, it's got to benefit others. I would add another ingredient in there, Ray, and I would say it's got to be autonomously pursued, right? It can't be necessarily something someone else assigned to us. So if we're working and we want to cultivate entrepreneurial mindsets, we have to find the intersection between our interests and abilities and the needs of the organization, right? That's how we tap into that compelling goal.
Absolutely. Belinda is singing our praises in a side chat with the panelists. But one thing that I thought is super exciting and that we haven't mentioned on today's call, because it'll come up tomorrow, the use of the Ice House program in libraries specifically, and how libraries can really be a hub, a catalyst for a lot of the changes societally that we're talking about. So super excited to hear about your excitement, Belinda.
Yeah. And, I want to come back to a point that I started out with, this all emerged from the observation and analysis of the everyday underdog entrepreneurs. I could not have discovered this by pursuing Mark Zuckerberg, the mindset and the methods of Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk, right? It was particularly the fact that I was looking at the underdogs and the misfits. That's what allowed this to emerge. And all that I'm really saying here is that in a rapidly changing, highly complex and ambiguous world, the employee mindset right? What are the underlying assumptions of the employee mindset, right? There are assumptions of stability. There's assumptions of linearity. There's an assumption that education is a one-time event, and I get my degree and then that's durable for my life. There's an assumption that someone else has figured out what is useful, and I'm expected to fulfill a predetermined role. That's the other directed, routinized nature that I was referring to earlier. Those assumptions, and I just kind of listed a few, are so deeply embedded in our individual and collective culture that we're not aware of it. And then, you know, when things change and shift happens and the world becomes highly ambiguous, we don't have the attitudes and skills required to adapt. And so what do? We double down on the employee-minded skills. We try work harder and harder. We get an extra job. We ask everybody to do more and more for less and less. And that sometimes works for a minute, but it's not the long-term solution. And I'm saying there's a hell of a lot to be learned about how to adapt and thrive in a rapidly changing world from the observation and analysis of these underdog entrepreneurs.
Absolutely. Charlene is asking, is saying, thank you for your insight. How do we ensure a positive entrepreneurial mindset is not tempered if there are unrealistic cash flow, financial management pieces which need strengthening? So talking about those more managerial skills.
Yeah, Charlene, thank you for that question. So I'm assuming that you're someone that works with small business owners or aspiring entrepreneurs in a small business development capacity based on your question. But one of the challenges I see in small business development centers is a failure to distinguish between entrepreneurial skills and managerial skills, right? And my point here is that the attitudes and skills required to discover an opportunity are distinct from the attitudes and skills required to exploit that opportunity. The former being entrepreneurial, the latter being managerial. So that's one point that I wanted to make. Now I'll address your question more directly. So you have people that come to you and they're, delusional about their idea. I've got the greatest idea since sliced bread. All I need is $50,000 and I'm going to be the next Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates. That's what you come into all the time, right? And so I think what you're asking is how do you harness that enthusiasm without killing it? Well, I can tell you one thing. If you want to destroy the entrepreneurial spirit, ask people to write a business plan. Like that'll kill it right there. So what I would say is what we want to do is guide people. And we're going to talk more in depth about this tomorrow, Charlene, but we're guiding people through a process of micro experimentation. Maybe you got the greatest idea in the world, but we're going to go find evidence before you put yourself at risk, right? And, the cash flow things, that comes after, to me, in my mind, there's the cash flow, the financial management. Those are managerial things that we really don't, at Eli, we don't really get involved in. There's plenty of great resources to teach that out here. We're in column one. We're about helping people find evidence of usefulness. And it's really you'll see this tomorrow, it's about an evidence-based process where we're behaving like detectives, trying to find evidence of usefulness. Also, to your point, Charlene, we're telling people, look, the trick here is not to fool yourself. And in this situation, you are absolutely, the person you're talking about, is the easiest person to fool. So it's a great question. I'm glad you asked it, and I hope that you'll join us tomorrow. We can get into the more details around how the Ice House addresses that specific question. again, it's really, you know, I did a lecture yesterday morning for the European Institute of Innovation and Technology to a group of young engineering students in Milan. And I asked them at the beginning, how many of you, I think there were about 30 students in the class, and I said, how many of you desire to start a business? And I don't think any of them did. They said, maybe later, maybe near retirement, but not in the near future. Okay, fine. Then I asked the question, how many of you want to discover an opportunity? And without hesitation, every single one of them said, yes, 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 right? That's really what entrepreneurship is. It's the opportunity discovery process, right? The world is fraught's the wrong word. The world is full of opportunity. We are at a time of unprecedented opportunity in the world. There's no shortage of opportunities. What there's a shortage of is the ability to recognize and act upon those opportunities. And that's what entrepreneurial mindset education is all about. It's our responsibility to figure out how to make ourselves more useful to more people. Again, my rhetorical question is, what's stopping you from becoming more useful to more people? So tomorrow's webinar, again, is how to use these concepts to create entrepreneurial learning environments, be they at home, in school, at work, or in your community. And since we've launched the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program in 2011, we've trained more than 2,600 facilitators around the world how to deploy this program. We've done workshops and lectures and keynotes, professional development programs for organizations all around the world. We've done them at the Kauffman Foundation. We did for Cisco. We've done programs for the U.S. State Department. Professional development programs to help organizational leaders understand how to use these tools as a framework for cultivating entrepreneurial organizations, be they academic, for-profit, or nonprofit. That's a big part of what we do. So, Nick, we're kind of running down the clock here. Any more questions in the chat function?
Nope, mostly just folks who are interested in talking to me about specific things, sending, email addresses or phone numbers, which to that point, if there's anything you'd like to dig into philosophically or in terms of practical application, feel free to shoot me an email. I'll be sending the follow-up email to this within 24 hours of this presentation being done. So happy to have those conversations. And then, as Gary mentioned, tomorrow's presentation is really going to be about the how-to. So if you're able, please feel free to attend to that. Yes, Belinda, you will get not only the PowerPoint, but the recording of this, as well as a few beneficial links regarding some of the topics that Gary's been talking about. Yes, absolutely. If you can't attend tomorrow's webinar, feel free to register still, so you'll still get the follow-up email for that one as well, if you're interested in that, again, kind of practical application side of things.
Yeah. Thank you, Nick. And also, there are a ton of resources on our website. There are case studies. There are course descriptions about our workshops, our professional development programs. There are course descriptions about the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program. We have 4 versions of it now: middle school, student success for high school and college. We have the Ice House Original and the small business edition of that. So,
absolutely.
And Belinda, we do a lot of the retreat training, a lot of professional development at retreat. So I just saw your comment in there, and happy to follow up with you on that.
Absolutely. Cheryl, thank you. And thanks for joining. All right, with the last 6 minutes, anyone else have any questions, comments, concerns?
All right. Well, I hope you guys got a lot out of this. I know I did. I love sharing these ideas. I really appreciate your comments and your feedback. You know, however this lands with you, please share your feedback, share it with others, give us your feedback. Hope to see you all tomorrow also. Thank you. Dan
Thank you,
Barwick.
Dan.
Hey, Dan, great to have you on the seminar again. Dan.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Cynthia.
Special thanks also to the folks from overseas that have attended the webinar from Africa. And we had 2 from Africa, Nick, and where was the other? There was someone else from I forget where it was now.
Yeah, I'm scrolling back to the top to see India. Yep.
India.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Thank you. And thank you for the folks. And I know, you know, it's late at night now in India. It's probably, boy, it's, you know, in the wee hours of the morning. In Africa, it's late in the evening. So thank you for taking time out to join us. No further questions, Nick. Well, I'm going to sign off, and I'll see you all tomorrow, same time, same channel. You'll get the slides and a follow-up right after this call. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody.